Hi, my name's Luke McBain. I'm here with my brother Chad McBain in Two Brothers and Bitcoin. And today, Chad, you sent me some articles. You sent me some links to some articles. And at first, I thought they were the same subject matter. And I was saying, why are you sending me two articles about the same thing? We sort of thought, well, we're going to dig more into the current events because things are really heating up with Bitcoin and interesting things are happening. And then you sent me these two links, and at first I was going like, now why two times the same article? But it's actually not two times the same article. And but the background is a little bit, let's say, complex. So I need you to explain to me what's going on right now in the U.S. House and Senate and why there's so much excitement around Bitcoin and what exactly are they planning to do and why is that so important for like normal people like us? And I'm just going to share like the first one, and maybe you can like walk me through it a little bit. It says here, it's from CoinDesk, and it says U.S. House approves crypto FIT 21 bill with wave of Democratic support. And why is
Yeah.
this now news? Why should I be like interested in this piece of legislation?
Well, I guess just going back a little bit to a quick summary, I think people involved in the crypto space would suggest that the previous Trump administration was relatively unfriendly to crypto, Bitcoin in particular. And then the Biden administration went from relatively unfriendly to openly hostile.
Right. Like I had that. So I just vaguely remember that Biden also made some statements which were not very friendly for Bitcoin, but
Yeah.
I could have remembered that wrong. And now this happens. So what's going on here?
Yes. So I would say that probably for the last number of years, there's been a back and forth between the crypto community and the regulators, and then of course the government itself. Um, which, for those who aren't familiar, in the United States, they kind of have the House, which is Congress, the Senate, and then of course the administration, which currently is Biden administration. Previously was the Trump administration, but we'll just call it the White House, if you will. So there's kind of three levels of governance in the U.S. And I basically, to sum up, neither administration of the last 70 years has been particularly friendly to Bitcoin and crypto. And the current administration, the Biden administration, has been outwardly hostile. One of the top senators, Elizabeth Warren, last year started something called the anti-crypto army. She's trying to get rid of Bitcoin in the U.S. and crypto altogether. Um, anyway, the bill that was passed last week in the House in Congress was a bill that they've been working on for a couple of years in Congress to bring some type of regulatory framework to the Bitcoin and crypto industry. And that is needed for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is allowing American citizens to understand what the tax implications of this would be, what privacy they have legally, not just from a technology point of view, um, what constitutes an asset, what constitutes a commodity, all of these things. Um, Up until now, these things have really been subjective, and the regulators have kind of been deciding this without Congress or the Senate, which is not typical of how U.S. law works. Usually, the representatives, whether it be the House or the Senate, tell the regulators what law is. So the regulators have kind of been ad hocing rule of law as they see it. So it's been a real mess for a lot of the developers in the United States, for a lot of the citizens that just hold Bitcoin or crypto, for a lot of the obviously the companies that are in the industry. It's been a regulatory nightmare, I think. Banking industry, everybody. So this is kind of the first real legal framework to start regulating crypto as you would any other type of industry, whether that be the technology industry, the banking industry, the farmers. I mean, most major industries have rule of law and a series of regulations that they have to follow. And crypto hasn't had that, not because most companies in crypto didn't want it, but because the administrations, and again, I'll say the Trump administration and the Biden administration were not friendly to the industry itself. So major news for the US, but I would argue probably big news for the world, because whether we like to admit it or not, at least in the Western world, when it comes to finance, we the rest of us, the Canadas and the UKs and quite frankly Europe, we tend to mimic a lot of what the US does from rules and regulations around different types of finance and banking. Not necessarily exactly, but we certainly take it under serious consideration, because at the end of the day, the US dollar is the reserve currency of the world. So if something is being accomplished in the US, it probably will be somewhat mirrored in most other Western countries around the world. Australia, I left out, but of course, Australia. So I think that's why it's big news, because we need a framework globally for crypto, but it starts with the US, in my opinion. We now have one that is bipartisan that passed. We'll see what happens in the Senate. But this is a huge first step to get bipartisan support. I believe in this particular bill, it was a 2/3 majority that passed it. And I'm not sure the total numbers in the House, but I believe that there was about 70 plus Democrats that voted for it, which up until very recently, Democrats by and large didn't vote for anything favorable towards crypto, or voting for it to be somewhat legitimized under law. So this is a big step.
Yeah, it says like 71 Democrats and 208 Republicans in favor versus 3 Republicans and 133 Democrats against. And President Joe Biden opposed the bill with a policy statement. It says here, though he didn't say he'd veto the bill, as he had recently when Congress sought to overturn a SEC effort to set crypto accounting policies. So, yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, the thing you already sort of like summarized it in a perfect way. But what well, for those who've been in the crypto space for some time, you longer than me, it is a big milestone, because I remember when I started investing into Bitcoin that I was sort of like paranoid, because I thought, well, yeah, because I thought reserve currency of the world is the US dollar. Bitcoin is actually much harder than the US dollar. It's inflation proof. It's actually something which is, in my opinion, much better than any fiat currency. It's going to, in the long term, outperform the US dollar. And the United States is not going to allow that to happen. Like, this is just something which is not going to happen. And I was paranoid. I'll be honest with you, I was paranoid that one day the US government would decide to ban crypto and Bitcoin just because the threat is just too enormous. And now the first thing which gave me big sigh of relief was when this SEC approval came for these ETFs. And now this step, it seems that actually things are progressing in a way which the Bitcoin maximalists had always prophesied. And of course, these kinds of prophecies don't have to come true, but it seems like Bitcoin is doing its Bitcoin thing. And would you say that's the case?
So I also was paranoid, but maybe a little less paranoid, because I don't consider myself a full libertarian, but I certainly have a libertarian streak in me that's growing as I age. And so I guess my take on it was going to do what it was going to do, and the government be damned. So it turns out we were both wrong, because it's going to do what it's going to do, but it also appears to be coming into regulatory framework, quite frankly, around the world. But as we're discussing here today, the US is probably the most important financial market for it to come into that framework. And then, in terms of, I'm not going to give much credit to the Bitcoin maxis, just because I find a lot of those people originally were also maybe staunch libertarians. So regulatory framework is just something that they probably at their core disliked. My take on it is probably more in line with what you're saying. I see the I was going to say potential benefits, but at this point, I think we're far past that. I see the benefits of owning Bitcoin in any amount, quite frankly. Obviously, the more, the better. I see it today, I see it for 5 years from now, and I see it for 50 years from now. So to me, I guess I'm quite happy. Well, maybe that's not true. I'm fine with the fact that it's being regulated so that we can operate legally and within a framework. As I said, most countries will probably mimic what the US does in this case. Some countries are actually ahead of the US in this, but they're smaller countries, so the world doesn't necessarily take notice of that. So we'll see what happens, but I think this was very big. I think how this came about was quite interesting because, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the Trump administration was relatively unfriendly to Bitcoin and crypto, and the Biden administration has been openly hostile towards it for the last few years. And I don't want to give Trump too much credit, but a couple of weeks ago, he was at a rally and somebody had just asked him about Bitcoin. And he said, well,
we'll get to that later. We'll get to that later.
Okay. Yeah.
Because that's also interesting news.
Yeah.
So is now a ban of Bitcoin off the table in the United States? Do you think these are developments where there's no more turning back from this point? There's no more, because basically, well, we'll get to that point also, that I think now the institutions and Bitcoin are getting too much interlinked and interdependent to really ban this technology, because this ban will create so much damage that there's no way that's going to happen. Or, well, how do you assess this now? Like, is it in general a good thing? Could there still be a ban somewhere down the road, like in China? Yeah.
I think if I was to guess, I think because it's very important to look at how the US looks at Bitcoin from a regulatory perspective. Even though they've been openly hostile, and I should qualify, they haven't been friendly to Bitcoin, but the one thing the US did years ago was they recognized Bitcoin as a commodity. Now, it's the only cryptocurrency, I guess, if you want to call it that has ever been recognized as a commodity. All the other ones at this point, in my opinion, are undefined. And the Securities and Exchange Commission is calling just about everything other than Bitcoin a security. We'll see whether that's true or not. But for now, to your question, Bitcoin being legally viewed as a commodity by the CFTC and the SEC means that they don't view it as a currency. So I think as a commodity, as a store of value, as an asset, I think the US government and regulators are fine with Bitcoin. Would they ever ban it? It's possible that they would have some serious restrictions to how you use it. That's what I believe. I think if people ever started to use it in the US, or even quite frankly, the majority of the world started to use it as a replacement to the US dollar, we may see a push to restrict that. I think Bitcoin as an asset, as a commodity, as a store of value, I think we're past that point. I think that too many wealthy, powerful players see it as an asset. So as a currency, yeah, I think the US would still be openly hostile to it. There is another thought process, though, that some people have, that by the time we get to that point, which might be 20, 30, 40 years from now, it won't be next year, it won't be 5 years from now. If we get to the point where a lot of the world would like to use Bitcoin as a currency, the US might be okay with it at that time. Again, we're talking decades from now, because they might have, from a financial perspective, control of maybe the majority of the Bitcoin. They already own, I think 850, 900,000 Bitcoin just in the ETFs now, you know? So it might be okay with the US government in 20 or 30 years to replace the US dollar as a reserve currency with Bitcoin, or maybe back the US dollar with Bitcoin is probably more realistic. So no, I don't see it being banned at this point, but I could see at least in the next decade or so, potentially some pushback if people actually want to use it as a currency. But even that, you know, the US dollar was backed by gold for a very long time. Bitcoin obviously is a digital version of that in the eyes of most. I could see possibly backing the US dollar with Bitcoin down the road if it ever reaches the scale that most of us think it probably is going to reach. So no, I think the days of worrying about it being banned are probably over. Yeah, in a country like China, could it be banned? Yes. But again, I think now we're seeing game theory starting to play out, where you see more and more countries start at least being open-minded to Bitcoin for geopolitical reasons that have to do with not wanting to be totally reliant on the US dollar as the reserve currency of the world. China would be one of the biggest, I think, countries that don't want to be reliant on the US dollar. Russia, obviously, is another one. And then there's probably many other countries as well. So I think that if game theory is playing out the way that I see it, I don't think China would want to ban Bitcoin anymore. I think there's probably some in the administration that regret doing it in the first place because they kind of had a head start, particularly when it came to where the mining was. And they've kind of lost that to the US because of their ban. And now we see them opening up Hong Kong. Hong Kong is launching ETFs or has launched ETFs now as well. So Russia has already said that they will take some trade in Bitcoin as one of many things that obviously, I don't know how much they're willing to take or anything like that, but they certainly said that Bitcoin was one of the things that they would be willing to discuss in terms of doing global trade, particularly in regards to some of the sanctions against them. So I think from a geopolitical perspective, we probably won't see that. I think we're now moving to an era of Bitcoin being somewhat mainstream, at least as an investment vehicle. Yeah.
Now, for the US dollar to be backed by Bitcoin, and I really I don't have the technical background to really know how that would work. How would that work? Wouldn't the governments or governments in general have to buy much more Bitcoin to be able to back their currency in this?
Yeah, so they would. Now, as I said, the 11 US ETFs currently, you know, on January 10th this year, no US investment firm held any Bitcoin that we're aware of, although some are now disclosing that they already had. But in just, 3.5 months, 4 months, we now have those 11 ETFs, all American, now holding about 850,000 Bitcoin. How many more months or years would it take for them to hold millions of Bitcoin? I don't know the answer to that, but if we just look at the current trend, I would say not that long, maybe only a few years.
800, just to remind everybody, 850,000 Bitcoin, they're already holding. Of how many Bitcoin are there in total?
Well, in total, there's 21 million Bitcoin, but, and these estimates vary, but it's probably reasonable to suggest that somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 6 million Bitcoin have been lost over the years, because back when it wasn't worth much, people would have it on their computers or whatever, and they'd lose it and they wouldn't care. And you know, there's a famous story about a poor gentleman in the UK who I think the value of his Bitcoin is somewhere around $200 million, but it was on an old laptop that's in the dump, and they won't let him excavate the dump to get the laptop. So people have passed away and haven't told anybody that they have it, so nobody knows the keys to access it. So it's believed that probably 25% of the total Bitcoin in the world is actually lost forever anyway. So we know there's 21 million, and that's it. But truthfully, of a global marketplace, there's probably only 15, 16 million that will ever be traded, you know?
And just to make that point again, from those 15, 16 million possible Bitcoin ever to be circulated, already 850,000 are basically sucked up by these 11 ETFs.
Yeah,
That's mind-boggling. That means like a
yeah,
huge chunk of that is already gone, and
yeah,
most likely they're never going to let go of that ever again. Maybe they're going to, trade back and forth some of that,
sure.
but it's not very likely that they're going to let that go. So that's a huge chunk of Bitcoin already in the hands of these
Yeah, and
investment institutions. Yeah.
that's in basically a 4 month period, a 4.5 month
Wow.
period. So if we look at it just on an annual basis, this time next year they might have 2 million, and 5 years from now they might have 7 or 8 million. Well, that at that point you're now talking about half the global supply of Bitcoin. So that's just those 11 ETFs. We don't know what else is going on. There's this is not my forte or my hobby, but there are companies that actually track the Bitcoin wallets of the world. They track the buying process. We don't know who is behind the wallets, but we can see what is happening in the wallets. And there's massive purchases going on from wallets that are associated with IP addresses in the Middle East. So there is some conjecture, speculation, that there are at least one or maybe multiple sovereign wealth funds starting to buy Bitcoin as well. So you could have a situation where you have governments, sovereign wealth funds, obviously banks, hedge funds, all trying to compete for something. And that's how it could be something that backs a currency, whether it's the US currency or another country's currency. Um, so it's an interesting I don't know, it's an interesting thing to watch, I guess, over the next 5 to 10 years as to what happens. But so much happening so fast just in the last few months would suggest that this would probably continue. Maybe the pace slows a little bit, but yeah, I can see the U.S. having an awful lot of Bitcoin within their borders over the next 5 years. You know.
Because our time's a little bit limited today, I just want to share the second article you sent me, and perhaps you can also briefly comment on that. That's the article from Fortune, which says bipartisan support of cryptocurrency is resurging. Congress hears why. And maybe you can tell me what the difference now is between this article and the last one we looked at, because actually they seem to be talking about something else. But why is this one also
Yeah.
relevant?
So this one is the SAB was 121, I guess. It was actually just a bill that had to do with I don't want to get into the weeds on this, but basically the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, had sent out I guess a protocol stating that banks would have to custody crypto assets, Bitcoin, uh, 1 to 1. So for every dollar they held in Bitcoin, they had to hold a dollar on their balance sheet as well, which is not done for any other asset or commodity that a bank holds. Banks can hold $100,000 worth of gold and not have to put up any more than maybe a few $1,000s in collateral against that gold. So it was pretty unfair. And the reason they did that is because banks then couldn't really hold Bitcoin because it would eat into too much of their collateral. So what Congress has done here is said that rule that the SEC passed was actually they had no right to do it. They are not legislators; they're regulators, and that they struck down that, and basically banks can now custody Bitcoin and crypto, and they don't have to custody it in any different way than they would custody any other asset. I guess is
Wow.
the easiest way to explain it.
But
So
that's quite something, because that's this I mean, something we talked about last time was this whole custody question. Like, if I own Bitcoin, where do I store it? And now a bank, bank could store it for me.
yes, so for a lot of people, including myself, by the way, the idea of having your own keys or some third party wallet provider hold your Bitcoin is a little unnerving, especially if you're new to the space. So now for investors, if they actually buy actual Bitcoin or other cryptos, in theory, a bank could now custody that for you. and it would be no different than them holding your cash or your jewelry or your gold or whatever. So yeah, I think it is big. Yeah, it's big in terms of for consumers, um, who want to be in the space, but like you mentioned earlier, this is a new space. They're somewhat unfamiliar with it. And the idea of custodying your own keys, particularly the technical process of it, can be intimidating for some people. And I would, not to be ageist, but probably the older you are, the less technically savvy you are. And yet those people, one would argue, might have the most amount of money that they'd like to invest in something like this. So I think it makes it more fair, and certainly makes the playing field a little bit easier for all of us to say, okay, I don't trust myself, but I trust my Royal Bank or my JP Morgan or whoever to custody it for me. And of course, all of the things that they custody are insured, which also helps. So if anything were to happen, you have that safety net. Now each jurisdiction is a little different, so I don't know how much they're insured for, but check with your local provider. But yeah, moving forward, I think American citizens will find owning Bitcoin much easier and custodying it much easier.
That's really interesting news. I wasn't able to really, when I started reading through it, get to the bottom of that. I don't know why it was written in such a bad way, and why, for lay people this cannot be simplified within this
No,
article. But I think that is really big news in terms of, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, imagine yourself buying gold and then storing it at home and just
right.
worrying all the time that, you might get robbed or something. And
Yeah,
well, it's better to bring it to a safe deposit box or a bank or something and have it stored
yeah,
there. It's much more secure. And the same is for Bitcoin. Like if you buy a certain number of Bitcoin and you just keep it at home or on your laptop, you're constantly concerned that something might happen. And
yeah,
this way you go like, okay, it's not like it's safer, maybe more convenient. You don't have to worry about it. As you say, there's some insurance on it. So that is big news. It really didn't trickle down to my level of
that's okay.
cognition of ability. But yeah, if I would have understood that, and especially like if something like this kind of news would happen here in Europe, certainly it's very interesting. That's just extraordinary. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so now I think we'll probably see the UK and probably Europe follow suit. Now, whether that's next week, next month, or 5 years, I don't know. But once the US is allowing their banks to custody it, I would think most jurisdictions, the banking industry in those jurisdictions would not want to be disadvantaged, I also thought it was very interesting, just to touch on this briefly, the UK has now allowed British citizens to now invest in Bitcoin ETF. But I thought it was interesting. It's only the accredited investors and high net worth individuals. So,
Of course.
so once again, the regular schmuck gets left behind. I'm sure when Bitcoin hits $1 billion, then they'll say, and everybody else can now invest in it too.
Right. Yeah, it's like what you said in your last conversation, that you're concerned that the regular Joe Schmo is still being left behind. And yeah, I guess part of our effort is to educate people on that and say, listen,
Yeah.
there's something important going on. Um, have a look at that. And it's beyond a game of something, some sort of silly internet money or something. As you said, it's like hitting mainstream, and as we saw with the ETFs, really quickly sucking up all this Bitcoin from the market. And
Yeah.
so the regular person has to now look into this. And I still see people being a little bit hesitant, but I understand that. It's totally understandable.
People need to do their own research. I mean, we're not telling people to do anything. This is not investment advice, but we are discussing an industry that is growing um, rather quickly. When you consider that, was it 14 years ago on May 22nd, somebody bought two pizzas with I think it was 41,000 Bitcoin, which is now worth around, in Canadian dollars, almost $1 billion.
Right. And
So in 2010, somebody bought two pizzas with Bitcoin. That is now, that value of that Bitcoin would be almost $1 billion Canadian. I think around 750 million US, something like that. So
Well,
in the
our time is up, I'm afraid. But I
okay,
think that was a last good thought out there. We said we're gonna, do a little bit shorter today, but it's good having you. Interesting news. Thanks for bringing those articles. I'll talk to you soon.
my pleasure. Yeah,
All right.
sounds good.